I don't know if you feel the same way as me, but I really enjoy models with a lot of contrast. Especially when it's subtle and not completely in your face, if you know what I mean. This model unfortunately was quite lacking in that department, and I wanted to change that. So grab your sunshades because today we're adding shadows using oil paints. What's up mates, today we're gonna take it nice and easy, because there's not much gear involved and everything I'm gonna do today is just paint and blend. Yet there's quite a lot of important theory behind this technique, so I'll be talking about that. Deal? All I'm gonna need is black-brown oil paint from Wilder and 2 pulls of enamel thinner, one for blending, one for brush cleaning. Like in most cases, it's necessary to thin the oil paint down a bit. I started with the lower hull because it has lots of large details, and most of them are gonna be covered with rolled wheels, tracks, and some earth tones. That makes this area perfect to start with something you're not completely sure about. I, for example, didn't have an exact idea how strong this effect should be and where should I use it. If this tank was painted in olive drab or Soviet 4BO, it would be much easier because I have more experience with those colors. But like I said, if you're not sure about something, lower parts of the model are the best place to try it out. So while I'm blending the effect, let me explain what's actually happening on your screen. This is a technique that Adam Wilder calls adding fake shadows, or how I like to call it, forced contrast. Depending on where and how you use it, it can create, just like the name suggests, fake shadows, or in other cases, a very faint, barely visible dark outline around certain details in order to make them stand out from the rest of the surface. I think there's no need to discuss the realistic aspect of this technique, let's just say it has nothing to do with reality and is just purely artistic. That's it. No need to say anything else. Consider that as a disclaimer. Adding these effects to your model will make it look more interesting, but you must be careful because it's easy to overdo it. We'll talk about that later. There is one more thing I like to address before we get to the bottom of this technique. I've been struggling with color balance during these past few videos. The color of this model is somewhat light grayish, yellowish green, and photos at the end of the previous video captured it pretty accurately. Unfortunately, it was when I saw those photos I realized how far the colors are in the video itself. I'm taking both pictures and videos with the same camera under the same lights, but I'm not a filming expert, so maybe the camera sensor has some issues when filming, or maybe it's something else, I don't know. I tried correcting the color as much as possible in post-production, and I think what you're seeing now is the best I can do at the moment. It's still not 100% how it looks in real life, but pretty close. Basically, it's just not green enough, which is unfortunate, but it's the best I can do right now. Okay, so now the running gear is finished, and I think it actually looks quite interesting. What do you think? So let's continue with the upper hull. These horizontal surfaces can get more tricky because there's almost nothing that could drop some shadow, so this is where we get to the forced contrast part. I started with this large panel because it's gonna be mostly hidden under the turret and there will also be a lot of dust added later, so the effect will get toned down. You have to keep this in mind all the time, there are many upcoming techniques that will tone this effect down, so if you make it more subtle, it would completely disappear later. It can be tricky to find the right balance, but once you try it on a few models, it will get easier, trust me. As you might have already figured out, this technique is pretty straightforward. First you apply the paint to a specific part and then you blend it. It's best to paint and blend one section at a time, so you'll have plenty of time to correct any mistakes and you'll also be more focused. This effect now visually separates the engine deck from the turret plate. And it also creates some contrast between the hull and the turret itself. Pretty neat if I do say so myself. Here's another example of adding contrast around hatches. The right one has the effect applied, the left one doesn't. Let's finish the other one. First I brush the paint around the entire hatch, making sure to avoid the hatch itself. Then using a medium-sized soft brush and small amount of enamel thinner, I blended the paint. Let's call this the initial rough blending. Now with the smaller and stiffer brush, I blended the paint again, this time without any thinner. This will smoothen out most of the rough spots. And again, using the larger brush and thinner, this time there's a bit more thinner than before, I blended it again. Using large amounts of thinner will also partially remove the paint, which was necessary in this case, because I wanted the effect to be more subtle. And to finish it off, I use a small fine brush with some thinner to remove any unwanted paint from the hatch. And you know what? I just realized that the distressing I did a few episodes ago is actually quite visible. It's not as strong as I wanted it to be, but I'll try to emphasize the effect in the upcoming videos. The gun barrel was treated the same way. I use this technique on every model, and it's a very cool way to add more contrast to the main armament. In this case, it can also partially work as some faint grease residue from the gun's recoil. Nonetheless, I think it looks quite okay. While I was adding contrast to the transmission hatches, I noticed something unpleasant, to put it mildly. Can you see it? No. Let me zoom in. If you think that's a crack, then you are absolutely correct. This is seriously the first time something like this happened to me, and I honestly cannot explain it. It's not just a crack in paint, it actually goes into the plastic. It might be hard to see how deep it is on video, but trust me, it goes quite deep. One positive thing is that it's very thin, so it should be possible to hide it with chipping or something. I don't know, but I'll figure something out. What really got me is that this happened on several places around the entire model, so I guess this is gonna be quite interesting, to say the least. My suspicion is that the plastic reacted with enamel thinner, which should never happen, but I pointed out how weird the plastic is before. And I also have to keep in mind that I have to stop doing stuff on my models just for the sake of demonstration. Adding contrast to these air intakes is definitely too much, but it took me a while to realize that, and when I did, well, it was already too late to remove it. Oh well. Luckily, I know lots of techniques that can tone it down and also work in conjunction with this effect, so I think we'll be good. Also, this would have worked pretty well on a dark colored vehicle, but in this case, not so much. So because of that, I was more careful on the turret. The commander's cupola is a perfect place for adding stronger contrast. This is also where natural shadows occur, so the paint will just emphasize them. Adding the same effect here will create a lot of subtle contrast between the cupola and the hatch. Now of course, I'm blending it quite a lot, because I don't want the effect to be too strong, and it will later work in conjunction with chipping and rust effects. These parts were quite frequented by the crew after all. But if I decided to have the effect heavier, it would perfectly replicate abrasion and continuous wear. So it would basically replicate chipping and would also add contrast at the same time. That's a technique I used a lot in the past, and I'm explaining it in more depth in my chipping for beginners tutorial, which you can watch by clicking on this card. But in this case it doesn't replicate chipping, it just forced contrast. I also decided to add more contrast to this big hatch and the smaller one next to it. Places like this can be tricky because they are one of the most exposed parts on this tank. They are not sunken in, so to say, there's no raised detail around them, and they are placed on one of the highest parts of the model. Therefore, I had to be very careful with how strong I make the effect. One of the things I talk a lot about on this channel is how chipping can create more contrast between parts or panels. This is an effective way to get that contrast in a less aggressive way, so I'll probably go a bit easier with chipping on this model. And finally, the machine gun ball mount was also treated the same way. It's a similar part to the gun barrel on the hull, so this can again replicate some grease residue as well. Note how I also added the paint around the side hatch. And with that, I guess we're done here. What I've shown you in this video is just one way to add more contrast to your models. You can, for example, add highlights the same way, just with the lighter paint. But I didn't want to go that far, so I guess we'll need to cover that in some other video. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful or at least interesting to watch, and if you did, you know exactly what to do. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, because I have more content like this coming your way. And if you'd like, you can also click the bell icon to get notified each time I upload. I think that's all I wanted to say today, so thank you all for watching, I'll see you mates in the next one, and here are some bloopers. And to finish it off, I used a small file. Fine. But if I decided to... But if I... What I've shown... I start... Like in most cases, is necessary to thin the... Like in most cases, is necessary to thin the oil. Blah, blah, blah. This is a technique that Adam Walder calls adding fake shadows, or how I'll, or blah. Let's just say it has nothing. Let's just say it has. Let's just say it has nothing to do with reality. Let's just say it has nothing to do with reality. These horizontal. These horizontal. Here's another example of adding contrast around hatches. In this case, it can also partially work as some faint grace.